There's no doubt when you get to such extremes of ability, there is something there that is very likely to have been inherited.
You don't think there will ever be a point in the future?
Well, first of all, there's no one thing that's intelligent, so you can't do anything.
But if we could identify those genes,
But if you've got 100 different genes that can each have a small effect on it, what are you going to do about that? You don't even know which those genes are.
Have you heard of Bryan Johnson by any chance?
I would not consider it worth supporting research that's wholly aimed at longevity like that without understanding the aging process better.
So Walter Bodmer of the University of Oxford is a pioneer in the field of genetics, with over 60 years of groundbreaking contributions. His work spans cancer research, population genetics, and human genetic diversity.
Selection during our evolution has not worked to enable us to live beyond the age of 45 or 50. So the big two contributions to the UK population, to what it might have been before, were from the Vikings and from the Anglo-Saxons.
Hi, so Walter, great to be here with you. So the first question is, genes play a significant role in influencing our characteristics and behavior. Things like eye color and height, they've been associated as significantly heritable traits all the way back till the late 19th century. I think today there's a vigorous debate about whether more complex traits such as intelligence, temperament, our personality, whether they're significantly determined by our genetics. I'd be grateful if you could provide us an overview on that nature versus nurture debate and on how much our complex traits are determined by genetics, and also give your own thoughts on the significance of heritability for more complex traits such as intelligence.
I think we've got to start from saying, well, what is genetics about? What do we mean by that? And how does inheritance work? And you've got to go back to Mendel in the 19th century, who studied peas, and he was the first to show that the inheritance was discrete. You could get tall peas and small peas, and you could get them segregating, so some of the offspring were small and some were tall. And that was the first real indication that the inheritance in its basic level is what's called discrete. And then from that, you went on to showing that you could get lots of traits that you could do genetics with like that. You could do it in flies. You could do it eventually in people. And then the question is, well, what determines all that? So what determines it is essentially a language, if you will, a chemical language that determines basically our inheritance, that determines to a large extent what we're like, and it's present in every cell. And so the ultimate discovery was the discovery of DNA. So DNA is a 4-letter language, deoxynucleic acid, DNA, and it's a 4-letter language. And those 4 letters in sequence have information in them. So all the information that is needed to determine a human or biological organisms, mainly from DNA, but sometimes RNA, is in those sequences. And those sequences occur in long stretches, which we call chromosomes, and the chromosomes come in pairs, so that from 1 to 22, you have pairs of chromosomes, and then you have an X and a Y. And the females carry 2 X chromosomes, and the males 1 X and 1 Y in the basic term. So really what's happening is when an individual starts, and let's relate it to people, you start from one cell that's derived from a sperm getting together with an egg, and they each carry half the amount of information, the sperm from the male and the egg from the female, and they bring it together. And that in that one initial cell is the same information that's present in all the other cells in your body. And that's what's the underlying information that drives the whole biological process, that sequence. So the question of how inheritance works is really a question of how mistakes or differences in those sequences are inherited. So not everybody will have the same bit of sequence. So a gene is a part of that sequence that has a particular function, biological function. And genes vary in their sequences, and some are very variable, some less so. And it's that sort of variability which is what we inherit. We inherit either one version of gene or another version of gene from either parent. That's the simple way to explain it. So when you're talking about, and you think about the body, it's made up of large numbers of different cells. Whereas if you count the genes in the simplest way, there may be only 20,000. But that's a very much an underestimate of the complexity that you can get from that piece of language. And so that every cell in the body carries that same information, but we have different types of cells in different parts of the body, all derived from that initial cell. So there are many ways in which that information can be used that give you huge variability within the organism, but also can give you a lot of variability between individuals. So the question of whether a trait is inherited is actually, to what extent does it relate back to a particular piece of DNA sequence? And some things are very straightforward. Some of the diseases, many people may know about sickle cell disease. It's a disease of the blood that originated from West Africa, and people and it's connected with resistance to the disease malaria. And it's a change in a particular gene that sequence makes the hemoglobin. It's the hemoglobin that makes the blood red and that carries oxygen. And so if you have a defective version of that gene, that can lead to that particular disease, and that's largely determined by that one difference. But when you look at more complex characters, it's much more difficult. You can't say that. Largely, you can say there may be many, many different genes that each have a small effect, which between them can give you differences. And so that doesn't inherit as a simple yes or no. That's the beginning, I would say, of the answer to what you want. And we can go into more detail.
Yeah, and what I wanted to focus on is the significance of heritability in certain complex traits, and one of them being intelligence. And so how much would an individual's intelligence be due to the genetics that they inherit and the environment that they're around?
Well, let's just talk a little bit about human ability instead of intelligence, which is a very difficult concept to define. I studied mathematics when I was in Cambridge, right? And I was quite good. I got a first and all that. I had a teacher, one of my teachers, Michael Attier, who was one of the most famous mathematicians of his at that time. He only died comparatively recently. And I just knew I could never be like him. There's no doubt when you get to such extremes of ability, whether it's in mathematics, whether it's in music, whether it's in sport, or whether it's a Shakespeare, there is something there that is very likely to have been inherited. And it's probably not just one gene that makes you like that, but it's something that makes you so that I don't care how much I would have done in mathematics, I could never be as good as Michael Attier was, which is why I never became a mathematician. So you have to think in terms of there are extremes of ability. If you think in height, there are dwarfs, and there are some quite clear single gene differences that are to do with, complex chemicals that don't work properly that can make you very small. And there are similar things that might make you tall. And there are some, hair color is a relatively small number of genetic differences that can give you the variety of hair color and so on. So that you have to think in terms of the fact that the phenotypes, what we're like actually, are quite complicated. And in some cases, there are very clear differences. There are severe inherited diseases which are due to a mistake, a well-defined mistake in a gene. You can identify what that is. You can often pick up what it might be in a fetus at an early stage. But if you're talking about general things like IQ, it's much more difficult.
So, sorry, what I wanted to clarify is let's look at any individual ability, whether it be running or intelligence or any sort of it. How much of that could you quantify comes from genetics, and how much of it could you quantify comes from environment? Is that even something you can do?
Well, let me put it the following way. I enjoy music and listening to Mozart. Mozart was a remarkable composer. Now, I'm quite sure that I could never be like him. Even if I was brought up within his family, I would never have done anything like him. And it's also probably the case that if he'd been born in the middle of a desert somewhere and not been in an environment where he could develop his musical ability, he wouldn't have composed like him. So everything is done in the context of an environment. But it's also clear that some of those extreme abilities clearly must have an inherited component that in the end it might be possible to identify what it is. Now, IQ is a sort of a measure. It's called I stands for intelligent, Q for quotient, where you ask certain types of questions, and the idea is that you can work out, in a sense, how logical someone is, whether they're sensible, and it's a very imperfect measure of the overall ability of individuals. And there's no doubt that if you'd given an IQ test to Michael Atiyah, and maybe even me, I'd get a reasonably high IQ, I don't know. And there's no doubt that there may be some genetically determined differences that can, to some extent, indicate whether you've got a higher IQ or a lower IQ to some. But that's a very crude measure of human ability. You don't necessarily have to have an IQ to be someone who's an outstanding tennis player like Federer was. So this idea that you've got a gene for something like IQ is simply wrong. What there might be is many, many different small effects that could accumulate to give you a tendency to one way or the other. But if you don't have a good educational system, you're never going to learn a language properly, are you?
You've kind of critiqued IQ over there, said it's an imperfect measure. A lot of other people have said this as well. Stephen Gould has said this. Howard Gardner has said this. Do you think there are more
I'm
universal...
not the first and not the last
You're
person
not the first,
to say
no,
that.
exactly.
And it's not a thing I would spend a lot of time studying myself.
Yeah. Do you think there are any better measures of, let's say, general factor intelligence or
You've
more
got to
broad
ask
and
the
universal
question, what
ways?
is it you want to measure these things for? The things that I'm more concerned about is, obviously, if you've got dyslexia, for example, which one of my grandsons has, if you don't take that into account, they may seem as though they're unintelligent. So it's not until after he got some way in a secondary school that they realized he was dyslexic. They allowed for that, and then he got a first degree in biology when he studied in Oxford. So this notion that there's something you can easily manage that way or should, I think is the wrong way to look at it. You want to, the first and most important thing is that everybody gets a good education. And some people may respond to that in different ways. And some people like certain types of music, other people like other types of music, some people don't like it at all. Some people are born deaf, obviously, and that's a very different thing. So I think this notion that you have some single measure that you use to define, how good someone is in some sense is I think is just wrong. And of course, during our lifetime, how we're educated, the environment we find ourselves in, they can all influence the extent to which your behavior develops. And so it's obviously a mixture of the background of the environment you're in and what you've inherited.
Just sticking to intelligence,
Yeah.
behavioral geneticist Robert Plomin, in his book The Blueprint, makes the claim that genes played a significant role in determining one's intelligence, and that while environmental impacts do play a role, they're largely random and unpredictable, and therefore less influential than genetics. And there's a quote that aptly puts his position, which is, "Parents matter, school matters, and life experience matters, but they don't make a difference in shaping who we are. DNA is the only thing that makes a substantial systematic difference."
I think that's just nonsense, really, to put it that way.
So there's
to be
plenty
quite
that
honest.
critique his position. Do you mind explaining why?
You get a potential from what you inherit that may, in some ways, enable you to do certain things better than others. I mean, I would never have been a good runner. I never did run much, but I swam reasonably well. But I would never have been an Olympic swimmer. So what? So I think to think in those terms is simply wrong. And what we get through our education and what we get through the environment in which we live in various different ways does have an influence on how our inherited information, which is there undoubtedly, how that eventually leads to what we are later on in life. And as I've mentioned, if you take someone like a Mozart or a Michael Atiyah, there are undoubtedly specific inherited differences there that enable them to do things that an ordinary person couldn't do. There are differences like that. But to say that you can that IQ in that sense, I think IQ is a measure that shouldn't really be used in that way, in my view.
Walter, you kind of mentioned the extremes a lot of the time. You said like extreme levels of intelligence, like
Yeah.
your professor, Mozart, that sort of stuff. Does the heritability only really matter the extremes, or even for broader population, can we actually see?
Heritability is a term that is reasonably properly used by geneticists who have a statistical background. And in a sense, it tries to estimate in anything you can quantitate, whether it's height or weight or some ability or IQ, if you can try and quantitate how much of what you've inherited is actually due to the genetic component and how much is due to environmental factors. So that's what a heritability is. And if a heritability is very high, if it's due to a single gene change, then it can be almost 100%. If a heritability is very low and it's something that's due to an infection that you more or less everybody would get or they wouldn't get. But on the other hand, there may be some aspects of what you inherit that influence what your response would be to a viral infection of different sorts. So the heritability is a very loose term in that sense. And the person you're quoting previously on IQ, they're using quantitative measures in which you can take a measurement of a lot of parents and a lot of children that's quantitative. And from the extent to which they come from families or not, if you want it at a crude level, or using genetic markers, as we call it, you can get some idea of what proportion might be genetic or not. If you take the extreme, the thing to look at is identical twins. Now, identical twins are twins that inherit exactly the same, almost 100% the same genetic component. So if you study similarity of twins, if you've ever met twins, their faces, you can hardly tell them apart. And so there are a lot of things that are very similar. And in a sense, that tells you that to a large extent, facial features, unless you have an accident and your face is altered, are very largely genetically determined. They're not determined by any one gene, but they may be determined by a collection of genes that eventually you could say something about, which we've tried to work on. So you can't make such general statements. Heritability is a very broad concept in that, and it's not a thing that I would use without very careful definition of in what context I'm using the word.
You might not be able to get smarter by gene editing, but you can do by listening to our podcast. If you like what you're listening to, please like, subscribe, and follow the Whitelist podcast. Your support helps us keep asking out-of-the-world questions and bringing top guests on like Sir Walter Bodmer. Thank you so much for your support, and let's get back to it.
I want to move on to genes and longevity. So the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Elizabeth Blackburn, has described telomeres, or the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes, as a proverbial fountain of youth. Can you tell us a bit more about the role of genetics in aging and death?
Well, I think I must start from a different point of view that I think is one of the most important things that people should learn in their education, that we are a product of evolution by natural selection. That means these genetic changes, sequence changes, which arise and which are inherited, will sometimes influence the extent to which we can have children, the number of children we have, how long we live. And the selection in that way has formed all the biological organisms that we see on Earth. Now, if you think of the human history, although Homo sapiens, modern humans, is a relatively recent concept in that you're talking about hundreds of thousands of years instead of millions of years, it's had a long period of time. And for most of the period of time during which the human species, Homo sapiens, the humans as we are, have evolved, they've not lived much beyond what you might call the end of the reproductive period. That's when you stop having children. And there's been no selection to select, or very little, if any, selection to select for any improvement in terms of the number of children, how much you contribute to the next generation in terms of numbers, that goes beyond the reproductive age. So selection during our evolution has not worked to enable us to live beyond the age of 45 or 50 to a large extent. We live beyond that age now because we've managed, with hygiene, with what we eat, with dealing with diseases, to create an enormous increase in the average lifespan. Even within the last 20 years, it's gone up, and certainly since the middle of the 19th century even. So this aging process is one that we are left with because of the way we evolved. And so it's not something that you can just change overnight and say, oh, we can find out what's different. It's not like that. We've not had the selection that actually favors us to live longer than we mostly used to do. I don't know whether that answers it sufficiently. And, the question of telomeres you're talking about, the person who got the Nobel Prize shared it for telomeres. One thought is that the length of the telomeres matters. I have my doubts about the extent to which that's actually a major feature in aging. But
Can you share why?
Pardon?
Can you share why you have doubts about that?
Because it's a process that's not necessarily connected with how old you are. It's difficult. We're made up of lots of different sorts of cells. And as you get older, some things, if you look at my skin, it's not as smooth as your skin, and it's got lots of little dots in it that are genetic changes, in fact, in those cells that I think take place when you're older, because there's no longer the mechanisms to stop that from happening. And I think there are many different of the parts of the biological processes that simply don't work as well when you get older. And it's not a simple one thing. It reflects on a lot of different aspects of the human body and the way it works. Of course, cancer in part is an example of that, where if you look at the incidence of cancer, which is a genetic disease at the cellular level, not so much inherited, the incidence of cancer goes up if you plot it like this, and that's age, and this is time. This is age, sorry, and that's the amount of cancer. It goes out like this, and then it goes up like that. And where it goes up like that is in the 45s to 50s. And so that's because we haven't evolved to protect us from getting cancer much beyond the reproductive age.
So Walter, I just want to touch on kind of the general point you're making, which is that, in our most sort of where we had the most selection pressure on us in terms of in the savannah, we didn't live beyond 50 usually. And so as a result, we don't really have those genes necessarily. But given how big the human population is, there are still people that we see that live to 100, that smoke a pack a day and live to 90. Surely by doing maybe gene-wide associative studies or like studying the genes of these people, we might be able to see some sort of link where actually certain genes or groups of genes might actually be associated with living to 100 or living to 90.
There's been a lot of work on that.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, it's very difficult to find anything you can say concretely. It's clearly that there may be some things that enable you to live a bit longer. But remember what we're talking about. The oldest person that's ever lived has never been beyond 110 or 120, and even then that's very, very unusual to get to that age. So what we're talking about is not really the lifespan, the maximum possible lifespan. It's the average lifespan. So when you draw an age curve with incidence, I mean, it used to go down like that, and now it goes down like that. So you're talking about what happens in the quality of life in the later stages of life. So I think there's very little data that I mean, there are obviously diseases you can get when you're younger that'll kill you off when you're younger, and that makes a difference. But I know of nothing, to my mind, and I've been involved in discussions like this, where you can really say that here's a gene that makes it more likely that you're going to live to 110 than otherwise. I just don't think that exists. I think there are too many other factors that are involved.
Is there anything baked into our genes that tells us about our mortality?
We all have roughly the same set of genes, very similarly. Individuals differ by, maybe 1% or more, but that's enough to make a lot of difference. So when you're talking about genes, you need to talk about variance in those genes. It's the variation in those genes. We have a very similar set of genes to what a mouse has, but we're very different. And that's due to different evolutionary processes that are pushed in different directions by taking different versions of a gene over a period of time. So
So are there any variances that could increase mortality for certain people? Are there heritable traits that
I
could
think at
lead
the
to-
moment I would say that I'm not aware of anything like that. And the main thing we've got to do about aging is to improve the quality of life. If you think about what the real problems we have with the health service at the moment, they're due to a lot of people like me who are living a lot longer. And when you live longer, you have more things that are wrong with you and you cost more in terms of healthcare. And what we should be thinking about is how to deal with the quality of life, not longevity.
On that quality of life in old age, like I've seen this with my own grandparents as well, where it does get very tough after a certain point. Are there any genes? Obviously, there might not be genes that are associated with longevity, but is there any research that shows that some people live better quality of lives in old age due to their genes, or you haven't seen anything yet?
Well, I think that's a difficult answer to. There are always some genetic differences that can make a difference. So if someone's got Alzheimer's disease, there's certainly some genes that make it much more likely that you'd get Alzheimer's, which, as you know, is a disease of essentially degeneration of mental ability. Whether environmental factors may also contribute to that to some extent. I mean, sometimes it could be infections even that have an influence on that. But there's no, to my mind, there's no simple way that you could say. And then let's go back to the Alzheimer's. So we know that certain gene variants make it more likely that you get Alzheimer's at an earlier age. What we don't know yet is how to take advantage of that knowledge. If we can identify someone who has that gene variant, do they want to know that they've got it or not? Could we find ways of preventing the aging process of the brain that's due to that particular change? That's something that one can work on and where there may be ways to answer it. So I think those are the sorts of questions we need to ask.
Just on that, where you're talking about there might be certain sort of alleles that are associated with Alzheimer's or other diseases, I want to look a little bit into gene editing and using CRISPR technologies, and seq-RNA is something that's sort of recently come out as well from Australia. Could there be a point where we could find someone maybe in their 20s, find out they got a bunch of alleles that are associated with Alzheimer's, and go in and actually change that to prevent that happening, theoretically?
That's possible, but that's too late probably to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that sort of gene change is going to be present in a large number of cells in the brain. You can't get into every one of those cells and change them. The time you want to do that, if you really wanted to do that, was almost before birth. Which nowadays you can take a sample of at a very early stage of, if you take IVF, if you take the artificial birth, IVF, you can take the cells that you're going to use for that and find out whether they've got a genetic change in. Now, you can do two things in a way if you want to do that. On the one hand, you can say, well, we don't want to go ahead and develop a child that we know has already got a genetic abnormality. Not everybody would agree with that. You can say, well, if you can treat that abnormality, does it matter if they have it? But those are things you can only do at a very early stage. So the sorts of things that you might be able to change with that technology are some of the diseases like the sickle cell I mentioned. So if you can give people blood that doesn't carry the sickle cell mutation, which you can do by taking cells from an individual has the cells, they have the stem cells that produce all the red cells, like you would do if you do a transplantation from bone marrow, and you could change something in one of those so that you're giving them cells that behave normally, and that might improve situations. That's the direction that people are going into in using that technology. But I think the notion that you could just change someone and put a gene in so they become a Mozart is just not on.
Is there anything you could do at the gene level to increase life expectancy or the quality of somebody's life?
I don't think we know that yet. I think
theoretically, is it possible? If you could identify certain genes?
I think it's unlikely, but there may be ways in which you could influence the way some of the different types of cells that we have behave. By giving a growth factor at an earlier stage in life and things like that. I think that's not impossible. But I think we need to know a lot more about the aging process than we do now before we can say that.
Do you think this is limited to before they're born, or can it be used on people like us?
Well, I think if you can't do anything until you get to people your age or even my age, it's not worth doing.
Have you heard of Bryan Johnson by any chance?
No, I haven't heard of him, but there are lots of people who are studying aging. I mean, there are foundations which have been founded by people with very large amounts of money that are supporting research on aging.
I think you'll find this one interesting. He's a tech entrepreneur who's founded Project Blueprint, which is dedicated to reverse aging and extending human lifespan. And he himself is the guinea pig for this project. And so he's got this quite strict regiment, which he hopes helps him extend his life expectancy. And essentially, he wants to be immortal. Whether that's going to be true, time will come to pass.
I think it's very questionable that he can do much about that. You can say that obviously it's better as you get older to keep exercise, not to overeat, not to smoke. I think beyond that, there's very little else you can do, whether you're a tech billionaire or not.
And I think the main criticism is he has this extremely strict regime, which includes a lot of the things that you said. It includes caloric restriction, it includes exercise, various supplements. But what he hasn't done is any gene therapy, and he hasn't sort of gone down to the genetic level to alter any of his genes. I was wondering how far could those changes take him?
I think it's a deadlock. I would not consider it worth supporting research that's wholly aimed at longevity like that without understanding the aging process better. And I think it's just a dream that, and you've got to offset doing all that against what your quality of life is. Do you want to live that way? Is it actually going to make that much difference? How doing it on one person like that, if he gets run over by a car, you're not going to find out what effect it was having.
So I guess you won't be subscribing to Project Blueprint. He releases his studies and he encourages people to partake in what he's found successful. So I guess you won't be.
I wouldn't listen to what someone like that says. I'm prepared to listen to people who tell you a bit about the diet, but it's very difficult. I used to run one of the major cancer charities, and obviously there's a lot of concern about the extent to which diet, and undoubtedly diet, can have an influence. But it's very, very hard to study. The time from when you get the first genetic change in one of your cells in the body to when you get a bowel cancer, say, can be 15 or 17 years. So what you're looking at, how much they were, exactly what the diet was 15 years ago when they didn't know whether they were going to get a cancer or not. It's very hard to get good data of that sort. And there have been a lot of different ideas. But the simple thing is a reasonably well-balanced diet, not eating too much, and not smoking are just very obvious answers to that.
So, Walter, I want to go back to something we've discussed previously, and it comes to, theoretically, are we able to alter certain genes for characteristics like height or intelligence? You were pretty pessimistic on that.
We've already said that. Intelligence is not going to be... The extent to which intelligence is influenced by one gene is almost certainly negligible. So you can't do anything.
But if we could identify those genes...
But if you've got 100 different genes that can each have a small effect on it, what are you going to do about that? You don't even know which those genes are. If you use what's called a polygenic risk score for something like that, you're taking a whole lot of genes that have very small effects and saying, if together the effects of the particular combination of those genes that you have gives you an increased risk, say, of getting an early breast cancer or not, then maybe it's worth knowing that and screening at an earlier age for that. But even that's questionable, although that may be worth doing. But to think of it in terms of altering those genes individually is just nonsense at the moment.
Let's say that we could identify all the genes that relate to intelligence in the next 50, 100 years.
All genes that relate to that probably be 10,000 or 15,000.
Let's say with ChatGPT, AI, we identify...
That's just
you don't think there will ever be a point in the future?
That's just thinking. Well, first of all, there's no one thing that's intelligence.
No, I agree.
If I wanted to do a study like this, and I would have liked to have done it, but didn't get funding for it, I would say look at people who have extraordinary mathematical or musical ability. And the way you can get at the genetics often in these is to look at the extremes of ability. It could be true also, of course, there's certain genes that may influence how well you can do in a sport, and there's some good evidence for that. And then you can begin to say, can we identify one or more gene variants that may have contributed to that extraordinary ability? And that's possible. But I think you'll only get it by looking at the extremes and picking them out. And then what you do with that information is entirely a different matter. Are you going to try and find out whether your child that you're about to get through in vitro fertilization has got a particular gene that might make them better able to be a musician, and therefore you'll teach them more about music? I think that's not a realistic way to think about things.
I think a lot of people are discussing designer babies and whether people could pick
Yeah,
certain
well, I think
traits
they
for their
should stop
children to have.
considering that. They should think realistically. They should listen to what we actually know about things, and improve the educational process. Get for their children what the children would like to do, and not force them to do other things. And make sure that they get a good education. If they're interested in music, let them have music lessons. If they're interested in doing sport, encourage them to do that. If they like to act, which I used to do when I was at school, give them the opportunity. There are lots of ways in which you can improve what you want to do for your children. And I had 3 children, and I've got 5 grandchildren. Sadly, no great grandchildren yet. I mean,
Fingers crossed.
It's naive in a way to think about these sort of things. And I think the trouble is that people don't learn enough about the realities of what we now know and what we don't know and what we're still trying to find out. And there are these ideas put forward that are just beyond reality, instead of focusing on the things we can do something about. We can do a lot, which is what I'm mostly involved in now, about trying to find better ways of treating cancer. We can do a lot about trying to find earlier ways of detecting it, and then if we detect it earlier, we can treat better. There are lots of things we can do. We must learn more about why certain genes do cause Alzheimer's occurring earlier, what we can do about stopping that process if we identify people at an earlier stage.
So, Walter, I absolutely agree with you in terms of ultimately with kids, you shouldn't be trying to pigeonhole them into a certain lifestyle, into a certain path. Problem is, when you look at how much money parents put into their kids, a lot of the time parents spend hundreds of thousands on their kids. They push so many different things on them. And in their heads, they're saying it's because we're trying to do what's best for our kids and give them the best possible future. Now, when we're talking now with CRISPR and seq-RNA about potentially sort of altering and editing sort of the blueprint of a person, inevitably somewhere in the world this might be happening, or do you not think this is taking place at all, where people are trying to make designer babies? We saw in China the guy who tried to edit the babies to be HIV resistant. I'm sure in other places it's happening as well.
Well, first of all, there's a huge ethical question as to if you can do something like that, how you would control it. I mean, if you just go back to in vitro fertilization and think of all the discussion there was at that time, and very sensibly dealt with, I have to say, by the politicians of the time, particularly Margaret Thatcher, as it turns out, who got good advice on just how you might control that. So there are huge ethical questions if you start saying you're going to mess around like that when you don't really know whether something's going to work. And there's a very strong opinion at the moment that it's quite wrong at the current stage of knowledge to think of using any CRISPR-like technologies in human in vitro fertilization. So I think that should stay that way until there's a very, very clear idea as to why you want to do it. So if you think you're paying a lot for education, think how much it would cost. And, people might want to get their favorite dog. You can make a twin from it, and things like that. They're hugely expensive to do those sorts of things. A lot more than giving them a good education. Most of which comes in the old days, I would say, by having lots of books at home. Now, by making sure they watch the right things and learn a bit from what they can get online in the internet.
Yeah, and that's why we have you on here with us today. But just on that though, like what are some of the negative effects you can see? Obviously, we completely understand the ethical concerns. Like this is something we shouldn't be messing with. But if, let's say, there are people today that are experimenting with IVF and CRISPR and making quote unquote designer babies.
I think they should not be allowed to.
Mm-hmm.
I think let's put it this way: I don't think it should be done in a way that would give rise to a living offspring.
Hmm.
You can do a lot of things now with you can take embryonic stem cells, as they're called, and you can convert them into tissue that is very similar to the living tissue which you have. And you can do a lot of things by studying that and finding out what the effects of certain mutations are, for instance, in those, because there you can put the mutations in and see what the effects are. So I think it requires a lot more work of understanding those processes of differentiation and the way that the different parts of the body develop before you would think of doing anything from of the sort you're describing.
Theoretically, if it was possible, could you also see a scenario where there were so many advantages for humans to procure such a process, like genetic diseases?
I think all of this barks up the wrong tree, in my view, and I keep saying that. What we know now at the biological level about how cells work, about how things work, is an extraordinary advance on what we knew even only 20 or 30 years ago. We can use that information to improve the current quality of life, to deal with diseases we now have, and to deal with some of the diseases that are diseases of old age. And we should focus not on that, and not on these airy-fairy ideas of what might be possible in 1,000 years.
That brings me to my next question, which is, can you give us a prediction for the advancement of genes in the next 10 years? Is there anything you're working on or that you've heard that will be quite impressive that might come around in the next 10 years?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, I've heard things, for instance, of advances that could explain a lot more of what happens with dementia. I think if you think of the problems of old age, dementia is a huge problem. And if you've ever had or known someone who is developing dementia, they just become a different person. It's very difficult. I have a brother whose wife, sadly, is going through a period like that. So there are going to be advances in understanding those processes. And there are going to be, I'm sure that there will be major advances in how we deal with cancer, which is a thing I'm largely involved in. And that's quite beyond trying to make sure that we do all the things, preventative things that we can do now at an early stage. So I think there are huge advances going to be in dealing with the diseases and problems we now have. There's no doubt about that. And that's what one should be looking for. But, we've also got to make it possible that we don't just deal with the diseases in a wealthy country like this, but we also make it available in countries, other parts of the world, where they don't have all the resources we do. I mean, we have a lot of other problems that humanity's got to face at the present time than trying to engineer a gene that's going to make you live to 120.
Absolutely. So Walter, just to talk a bit more about some of the work that you've done. So you did some amazing stuff on the People of the British Isles project. So
Yes.
for people that haven't heard of that before, could you give like a brief summary and what you found in that?
Yes, certainly. As I've mentioned, we all differ a little bit. My difference is different than yours. One thing, for example, is you would know if you wanted a bone marrow transplant from me, it probably almost certainly wouldn't work on you because the chances are it would be rejected, and that's because there are differences between us, and we know what to a large extent what those sorts of differences are. So that's why you can match people for transplantation. So I bring that up, and we know that there are certain specific genes that will change eye color, that will be different for facial features, that will be different for hair, and so on. So that there's a lot of variation there. But it affects a small proportion. But when you think of the amount of DNA we've got, a small proportion, 1% of that difference, you're talking about thousands of differences. So we all differ to some extent. Now, when humans have lived in groups for a long time, they tend within those groups, before there was a lot of movement around, the groups that tend to marry within their group are going to be more similar if they're based in England than if they're based in China. And there'll be reasons why those differences have happened. Some of them may be different selection. Some of them may be skin color, because you get that light skin color when you go up north and you need more sunlight to get the vitamin D and other things you need. So that if you study populations in detail, you will find that there are differences between them. So what we did in our study of people of the British Isles, we said, well, let's find out what we can about people who would be, at the face of it, more likely to be British. In other words, we went to people, all four of whose grandparents were born roughly where they come from, say within the county. And so we're excluding the effects of recent migration, and especially the movements that came from the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. And then we say we can now look at people's genetic makeup. I mean, when we started doing that, we were looking at a lot of variants. We could look at 500,000 things that we knew would be likely to vary. And then we can say, how similar are people with respect to those? Can we cluster people so that we put in a cluster people who are statistically more similar in their genetic makeup? And when we did that, so we did it only on a few thousand people, we found more than we ever expected, that if you take these clusters, which you found purely from the genetics and the statistics, we know where they come from, but we didn't take any notice of that, and we plot where they come from, then the clusters genetically match the geography in a remarkable way. So there are no doubt, so we could even distinguish to a reasonable extent people who came from Devon or Cornwall, which you would never have thought was possible. So you get this variation, which is part of the history of the way that humans have evolved. And in some cases, that sort of variation can be very important from a practical point of view. So if you get a sickle cell disease, if you get a sickle cell variant, you almost certainly have, going back some way, an African origin that may have come by the Caribbean. If you want to match people for bone marrow transplantation, it's no good taking a load of Brits and saying that you'll find anything that matches up someone who comes from the Caribbean. So some of these differences do matter, that you'll find certain types of gene variants that give you more chance of a disease in one group than another. And of course those groupings of individuals can tell you something about the history. So we can say, by studying the surrounding European population, where do we find things that are similar from different European countries in the people of the British Isles? And so you can get the influence, for instance, of the Norse Vikings when they came, and see that there's more of an input from those into the people that live in Orkney especially, and if you move down a little bit to the south, but you get much less of that admixture if you look at people from the south of England. So you can mix up to some extent what's known from the historical background with what you find genetically. And we found that was very interesting, and it was the first study to go down in that detail. We did that with a colleague, Peter Donnelly, and his colleagues, who did some of the statistical analysis, because there were techniques that made it possible to get a better assessment of how people differed, so you got more accurate assignment.
So is it fair to say that there is a genetic basis for race and or ethnicity, or the two things different?
No, there are genetic differences on average between people from different areas. They will be smaller if they're from Devon and Cornwall than if they're from Devon and China. And the extent, and to some extent, those differences, of course, are connected with the cultural differences of those people. But to say that there's a race is largely used in the context of what I would say is largely a cultural thing. And we've become much more American over the period of time, over the years since I was a kid, anyway. And that's not because of a genetic change; it's because we're learning cultural things. I mean, the British Empire, for whatever its problems were, distributed the English language, and that's why Australians speak English, and why there are not many of the original native population left in Australia, so that a lot of there is no obvious connection in any way between the genetic makeup and the cultural one, although there tends to be a similarity. People in Britain speak English, and they are different even from people in Sweden who speak Swedish. So there are correlations like that just come together with the cultural tendencies that tend to occur with people in the same geographic areas. But the two are not connected in that way. So when you're looking at genetic differences, you're looking at the ancestry differences, where people come from. You're not looking at the cultural nature.
You mentioned sort of the native Australian population there. Just before we round things off, I want to ask, is there a genetic basis or genetic reality in the fact that there's a native or indigenous British population?
Well, it's a matter of how the human species as we now know it developed. What we know reasonably is that Homo sapiens, modern humans, probably originally grew out of in Africa, that there was a population of people like us in Africa that had been developing for some, I don't know, it's probably hundreds of thousands of years, and that the rest of the world was then populated by movement out of Africa to the rest of the world. But that was only about 60,000 or so years ago, which is a very short period of time in evolutionary history. And there were different groups went to different places, and they developed differently. So there were some groups that went as far down and along the coast to Australia, and there were other groups that went to the east and to the west. And so they developed partly by chance in different ways and partly by the environment. I mean, as I mentioned, the light skin is certainly a product of moving north to a large extent. There are genetic differences there, just because the people who actually moved there were different than the ones who moved to the centre of Europe.
Okay, yeah, no, that makes sense. So there are differences, but there's a lot of interplay with the culture, with the environment.
And of course now, what we did with the people of the British Isles, we went to rural areas, not in the big cities, because that's where you're likely to find people where there's not been a lot of recent admixture. Of course, the more that people can travel now, the more things get mixed up. I mean, you wouldn't do a study like that in London.
Looking a bit more at sort of the British Isles, what's the genetic history of the different populations that have come here, and what's the impact that they've had?
Well, it's very interesting. I think the biggest first impact is that it was surprising to us that we could find those differences, and I think that's because of the way we collected the data from rural areas and people who come essentially from those areas. Because you have to remember that until recently, people didn't move around a lot. Of course, there were movements, large movements, but most of the people lived in an area and married closely to the people who lived in that area. There were clusters that, over a period of time, of course, there were some movements. But I think what we found was very interesting is how we could interpret some of the variation that we found. I've mentioned that by comparing the British data with what we could find in European countries, where there'd been similar studies, not quite on the same depth within a country as ours, but similar. So we could say, what's the makeup of someone who comes from Orkney? If we say partly they come from Norway, they might come a bit from Germany, other countries where we got data. And that fitted quite well into the history, as I mentioned. So that it was very clear that, and we know there was a Scandinavian, there was a Viking lordship until sometime in the 15th century in Orkney, and you can see that. So you can see there's a higher contribution from the Norwegian background there. Obviously, Norway's changed too, but it's still there, and so you could find these changes, and we could find out that the biggest differences, quite surprisingly, were amongst the Welsh. They may represent more of the origin of the people that were there before there was the big influxes were from the Scandinavians, from the Vikings that were different in Norway and Sweden than the ones in Denmark, and of course from the Anglo-Saxons that came from the lower part of Denmark. And one has to remember also that the UK, until about 12 or so thousand years ago, there were no there were some human remains, modern human remains, that may go back to 30,000 years, but they almost certainly died out. And it was not until the end of the Ice Age, about 12,000 years ago, that people moved up into the UK.
Walter, my next question is, so we've had a few invasions in the UK. We've had the Vikings, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah.
Which one left the most significant mark on our genetic
Well,
code?
that's a very interesting question. The Vikings left a very clear mark, the Norwegians. Probably to some extent the Danish, but they're hard to distinguish from the Anglo-Saxons. So the big two contributions to the UK population, to what it might have been before, were from the Vikings and from the Anglo-Saxons. The Normans and the Romans didn't leave much here. They were an elite group that had a dominance on the culture. And Anglo-Saxons, eventually, that's presumably the origin of the English language, because the previous languages were Gaelic. So they can have a huge influence, and the Romans did, without a lot of exchange genetically influencing the makeup of the populations. And now that you're able to study ancient DNA, you can begin to say more. There are some ideas there which I think are quite wrong, but obviously you can begin to say something about those sorts of admixtures. And if you go back, I mean, the guy who got the Nobel Prize for finding Neanderthal and getting their sequences started the whole business of being able to analyze the DNA from graves. If you go back maybe up to 10, 20, 30,000 years to some extent. And so you can begin to get some idea of the origins that go back further, although the amount of and quality of that data isn't necessarily quite as good. So we're getting a picture of our own evolution in a way that's interesting. People, when we did these studies looking for people who came from the same area, we had to go and set up shop and advertise that we were going to do these collections. We got a lot of people coming to us being willing to give a blood sample and take part in the study because there's so much interest in people and where they come from.
Yeah, Ancestry.com has boomed. So many people are willing to find they're just interested in finding out where they're from.
Yes,
so they're willing to give, irrespective of where the data ends up. I don't think they really care. They just want to find out who they are, essentially. I think that's a big question for everybody.
Well, I think there's a lot of interest in that. And we had someone who was very upset when we said he wasn't a Norse Viking, but we said, but there were Vikings that came from Denmark, and you could be one of those. And then there would be, there was a set of television programs that were okay, not marvelous in my view, but where we were allowed to identify some people, because generally speaking, we didn't give any individual identification. We didn't even give people back their own detail because we felt that was not what we were doing. But in a few cases for the program we did, and so we had some people from Wales who were delighted that we said, yes, there was a huge probability if we hadn't had any other information, but there's that we could have said they came from Wales, and that really made them very happy because people are very worried about the idea of where they come from.
Yeah, so you think those DNA tests, they're worth the money? Or they're quite accurate in terms of...
If you want something like that, yes. Mm-hmm. In fact, the two companies that are well-known, Ancestry.com and 23andMe, I think they're having trouble now. Their data, they use a lot, at least have used a lot in the past, of our data from Britain to tell you where you come from as far as the British origins are concerned. So that there is a lot of interest, but you need those studies in every different part of the world.
And what do you think about, essentially, right now it's private, you have to pay for these tests, but the NHS offering them for free because knowing your genetic makeup is so crucial in knowing sort of what kind of genetic diseases.
Well, it's not quite that simple. There is a big, first of all, the UK, it's not just the NHS, did a sort of a UK biobank study. And that had a different purpose, and I think it proved extremely useful. Their aim was to get 500,000 people, in which you could do a detailed genetic complete sequencing and that, but also get a lot of information about their health status and so on, and eventually when they died and what diseases they had and so on. And that has proved to be extremely useful because you can use that information to find out more about the genetic background of the people, of the different diseases that people get. And the idea, and there's always a certain small proportion, it's a few percent, could be as much as 5%, of newborns that have seriously defective genes that are rare extreme genes that are certainly caused by just one change. And there's no doubt that the more you know about those, the more you could do something about them, because very often, like phenylketonuria, which is a disease where you don't, where you get problems if you get phenylalanine, one of the amino acids that make up proteins in your diet, and you can avoid that problem by making sure they don't get that diet and so on. So there are ways in which those where you know what the gene change is, you can do something about it. So that there's a program now to try and do 5 million newborns basically with large-scale sequencing to try and see if one can improve what you can do at least about those extreme diseases, and maybe eventually about less extreme, but still where you could do something about the genetic makeup.
Yeah, makes complete sense. So Walter Bodmer, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I hope I've been able to answer all your questions. Would have taken a lot longer if I'd answered them properly.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there anything you'd like to promote before we wrap things up, or any work
except
you're doing
to
at the moment?
emphasize that the genetics at the cellular, at the level at which we try and study diseases is hugely important. And it's much more important than deciding whether you've got a gene that makes you a genius or not.
On that note, that's a perfect message to round things off. Thank you so
Thank
much, Sir
you.
Walter Bodmer.
Hi guys, if you enjoyed our conversation with Sir Walter Bodmer, please follow us on all our social media channels.